Royal Guard TAKES control, after Camilla's son crosses a line with George. The evening had begun like any other at the palace, with a glittering assembly of royals, dignitaries, and a few carefully invited guests from high society. The grand hall was bathed in warm light, the chandeliers casting a golden glow over the polished floors. Servants moved silently, offering trays of delicate refreshments while musicians played soft melodies in the background. Laughter and polite conversation filled the room, punctuated occasionally by the quiet clinking of fine china and glasses. Everything appeared calm, elegant, and perfectly controlled. But behind the shimmer of opulence, a quiet tension was brewing, one that very few could see at first. Camilla's son, a young man in his early 20s, had a reputation for being spirited, impulsive, and sometimes careless with words or actions. Despite being well-educated and charming in many ways, he often acted without fully considering the consequences, a trait that had occasionally led to minor embarrassments at smaller gatherings. Tonight, however, would prove different. He had been in the palace for only a short while, weaving through groups of guests with a mixture of confidence and mischief. He enjoyed being the center of attention, often laughing loudly at his own jokes, gesturing broadly, and sometimes drawing slightly uncomfortable glances from the more reserved attendees. Tonight, he seemed particularly lively, a little more daring than usual. Some whispered that he was restless, perhaps frustrated by the weight of expectation that seemed to follow him wherever he went. George, on the other hand, was very different. Younger than Camilla's son, George was calm, polite, and careful with his words. He had been taught to observe, to listen, and to act with caution, understanding that in a palace, every gesture could carry meaning far beyond its immediate context. Unlike Camilla's son, George preferred quiet conversations, measured laughter, and subtle humor that did not draw unnecessary attention. He was thoughtful, often thinking 2 steps ahead, and deeply aware of the fragile balance of reputation and relationships that governed the royal household. The 2 young men had crossed paths only a few times before, each interaction polite but distant. Tonight, though, the crowded hall and the jovial atmosphere created the perfect opportunity for a collision of personalities. Camilla's son spotted George near a cluster of younger attendees, laughing quietly at a story someone was telling. A mischievous idea sparked in his mind. Perhaps it was boredom, or perhaps it was simply his usual impulse to stir things up, but he decided to play a prank. It began harmlessly, or at least he intended it to. As George reached for a glass of sparkling water, Camilla's son, moving quickly and without warning, tapped his shoulder in a playful but unexpected way. George turned, startled, and in that brief moment, something slipped. A small, embarrassing detail from a personal story George had been sharing quietly with a friend. It was amplified by the crowded room, and several nearby guests noticed. A few chuckled softly, thinking it was part of the joke, but others exchanged uneasy glances. George's face flushed slightly, a mix of surprise and embarrassment, while Camilla's son laughed, thinking he had created a harmless moment of fun. But the effect was immediate. George, usually composed, felt caught off guard in front of so many people. His friends offered quick reassurances, but the incident lingered, subtle but palpable. The conversation around them shifted for a moment, eyes flicking between the 2 young men. What had been a casual gathering now held a quiet tension. Some guests whispered to one another, unsure of whether they had seen a simple prank or the start of a more serious disagreement. Meanwhile, Camilla's son, noticing the ripple of attention, felt a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. He enjoyed being noticed, and in that brief moment, the incident seemed to serve his desire for attention. But he did not fully understand the depth of the reaction he had triggered. George, sensitive to both social dynamics and the weight of family reputation, quietly withdrew from the immediate crowd, seeking a small corner where he could regain his composure. He felt the sting of embarrassment, but also the discomfort of realizing how quickly appearances could shift in such a setting. The royal guard, always present in the background, noted the incident as well. Though their presence was subtle, they had trained eyes, and nothing escaped their notice. Their responsibility was not just to protect physical safety, but also to preserve decorum and prevent situations that could escalate into public embarrassment or scandal. Observing the playful but disruptive behavior of Camilla's son, they quietly shared knowing looks, recognizing the potential for a minor incident to spiral if left unchecked. As the evening wore on, the tension did not entirely fade. Camilla's son, seemingly oblivious to the effect of his actions, continued to move through the hall with a mixture of charm and impetuosity. George, on the other hand, maintained his calm exterior, yet inside, he reflected on the importance of boundaries, respect, and careful behavior, lessons he had learned quietly over time. The room around them continued with polite laughter, soft music, and formal conversations, but a subtle undercurrent had shifted. The lighthearted mood now carried an edge, a sense that something more serious had quietly taken root. Later in private conversations, guests speculated on what had occurred. Some downplayed it, assuming it was typical youthful mischief, while others sensed the delicate balance had been disturbed. In the corridors and small lounges of the palace, staff and family members exchanged careful words, aware that the incident, though small, could have implications beyond the room itself. It was a reminder that in the world of royalty, even minor actions were observed, recorded, and remembered. By the time the evening drew to a close, the incident had already begun to take on a life of its own. George, composed but thoughtful, reflected on the unpredictable nature of social dynamics within the palace. Camilla's son, energetic and somewhat unaware, still enjoyed the sense of attention he had sparked. And in the quiet corners, the royal guard silently noted their next steps, aware that preventing escalation would require careful observation, subtle intervention, and, if necessary, firm guidance. Though it seemed like an ordinary evening of formalities, the encounter between these two young men marked the beginning of a series of events that would test patience, responsibility, and the delicate art of maintaining dignity in public life. What began as a playful gesture had already set in motion a quiet ripple, one that would influence relationships, family dynamics, and the unseen mechanisms that held the palace together. As Camilla's son departed the hall, still smiling and chatting with friends, he could not see the full impact of his actions. George, meanwhile, quietly composed himself, understanding that discretion and calm were often the strongest responses. And somewhere nearby, the royal guard remained vigilant, ready to step in if the playful moment threatened to become something far more serious. The evening ended with the soft sounds of music fading, the guests leaving with polite farewells, and the palace returning to its calm state. Yet beneath the surface, the subtle tension lingered. In the days to come, the incident would be remembered, discussed, and carefully managed, a reminder that even moments of seeming mischief could carry consequences far beyond the immediate laughter or embarrassment. It was a night that began with elegance and laughter, but quietly became the starting point of a lesson in responsibility, restraint, and the unseen influence of those who ensured the smooth running of royal life. In that glittering hall, under the chandeliers, the seeds of a story had already been planted, a story that would unfold slowly, quietly, but with significance for everyone involved. After the evening's incident, the palace slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but behind the grand doors and polished halls, the effects of that small moment began to ripple quietly. Camilla's son, unaware of the deeper consequences of his playful prank, continued with his usual activities, laughing, joking, and moving through the palace with the same energy that often drew both admiration and mild exasperation from those around him. However, not everyone was as lighthearted. George, though composed, found his thoughts returning again and again to the encounter. He was a young man who valued respect and caution, and the unexpected embarrassment had made him reflect on the importance of boundaries, not just for himself, but for everyone in the palace. The experience reminded him that in the royal environment, every gesture, word, or action could carry more weight than it seemed. He had learned early that discretion and tact were not merely polite habits. They were essential tools for survival in a world where appearances mattered as much as truth. Meanwhile, the royal guard, who had observed the incident from the start, began their quiet internal discussions. These men and women were trained not only in security, but in judgment. They knew the palace was more than a residence. It was a public institution where private behavior could have public consequences. While many incidents at social gatherings were minor and harmless, the guard recognized that Camilla's son's impulsive nature and the young prince's sensitive demeanor could create a problem if not managed carefully. The guards' officers met discreetly in a small, secure room adjacent to the palace corridors. The walls, lined with photographs of past events and family members, seemed to amplify the seriousness of their discussion. Each officer spoke in hushed tones, aware that even a casual mention of the evening could travel far if overheard. They reviewed the details, the prank, George's reaction, and the subtle but noticeable shift in atmosphere among the guests. One of the senior guards, a man with decades of experience, spoke first. "It was harmless in intent," he said, "but the outcome was not harmless. The young prince was embarrassed, and that type of tension, even if small, can spread quickly. We need to ensure it doesn't grow." Another officer nodded in agreement. "He's impulsive," she said of Camilla's son. "We have seen it before. Usually it's manageable, but the challenge is that he doesn't always understand the consequences until someone steps in. We need to be subtle, or we risk making him feel attacked and causing further issues." The guards debated carefully, weighing their options. They were trained to act decisively when necessary, but they also understood that intervention had to be delicate. The last thing anyone wanted was a confrontation in public that could escalate and become a scandal. The palace's reputation depended not only on the family, but also on the ability of those behind the scenes to manage situations before they became crises. After hours of discussion, a plan was formed. The guard would maintain a close but discreet watch on Camilla's son, monitoring his interactions and guiding him away from situations where his impulsive nature might lead to further embarrassment or conflict. At the same time, they would ensure that George felt supported and safe, allowing him to continue his routines without fear of repeated incidents. The key, the officers agreed, was subtlety. No one should feel publicly corrected or controlled, but the message had to be clear. Certain behaviors were not acceptable, and the palace's dignity must always be preserved. In the following days, the palace operated with its usual precision. Meetings, social visits, and formal events continued, but the royal guard quietly shadowed Camilla's son, guiding him without drawing attention. They arranged small diversions when necessary, inviting him to private conversations, redirecting him toward charitable tasks, or ensuring he was accompanied by other family members during public appearances. At first, he barely noticed. The young man was so caught up in his own world that subtle guidance often passed as casual suggestion or polite advice from those around him. George, on the other hand, observed the shift with a mixture of curiosity and relief. Though he did not know the full extent of the guard's intervention, he sensed that the tension he had felt at the gathering had eased. He found himself able to attend events and socialize without constant worry, appreciating the sense of calm that now surrounded him. Still, he remained cautious, aware that appearances could be deceiving and that young Camilla's son had a history of unpredictable behavior. The dynamic within the palace was now quietly different. Conversations among staff, subtle glances during social events, and the careful scheduling of Camilla's son's appearances all reflected a new level of attention to detail. The royal guard's influence was everywhere, though invisible to the casual observer. It was a delicate dance, guiding without imposing, observing without interfering, and preparing for the possibility that their presence might be needed more directly in the future. At times, the young man grew restless. He noticed that certain opportunities for mischief seemed to vanish, that moments where he might have acted impulsively were subtly redirected. At first, he shrugged it off as coincidence or the natural flow of events, but slowly, he began to sense the invisible hand that guided him. He felt a mix of frustration and curiosity, wondering why the palace environment seemed so controlled and why some paths were subtly blocked while others were opened. Meanwhile, the royal guard continued their careful watch. They balanced firmness with encouragement, rewarding positive behavior with freedom and subtly discouraging actions that might lead to embarrassment or conflict. Over time, Camilla's son began to recognize that his choices had consequences, and that the palace operated not just on rules, but on a network of guidance and oversight designed to protect everyone involved. George, observing from the sidelines, felt a growing sense of respect for the quiet, unseen work of the guard. He realized that their role went far beyond security. They were mentors, advisors, and sometimes silent enforcers of the rules that kept the royal family safe and dignified. The lessons he had learned through the incident became more meaningful. Responsibility, respect, and the ability to navigate social dynamics with care were not abstract ideas. They were essential for maintaining harmony in the palace. The situation also sparked quiet reflection among the staff and family members. Camilla, observing her son's behavior, recognized both his energy and his need for guidance. She understood that youthful impulsiveness was natural, but in a world as public and scrutinized as the royal household, even small missteps could carry larger consequences. The guard's intervention, though discreet, became a model for how challenges could be addressed without humiliation or conflict. Days turned into weeks, and the initial embarrassment of that evening began to fade from memory in the public eye. Guests and social acquaintances noticed only that George and Camilla's son continued to attend events with decorum, no further incidents reported. Behind the scenes, however, the royal guard's careful guidance continued. Each interaction, each public appearance was subtly shaped to ensure harmony, to teach lessons without confrontation, and to maintain the family's dignity in every detail. Over time, Camilla's son began to internalize some of the lessons. He noticed the effect of his actions on others and started to understand the importance of thinking before acting. The process was gradual. He did not transform overnight, nor was every impulsive thought immediately curtailed. But the steady, careful attention of the royal guard helped him grow more mindful, giving him the tools to navigate social situations with increasing awareness. George, too, benefited from the careful management of the situation. He learned that calmness, patience, and observation could often resolve potential conflicts without confrontation. He saw the value of quiet guidance and the impact of thoughtful oversight, gaining insight into the invisible structures that kept the palace running smoothly. The incident became a quiet but significant turning point in his understanding of responsibility and human behavior. The palace, as always, continued its routines. State matters, ceremonial duties, and public engagements went on without interruption. Yet beneath the surface, the lessons of that single evening had reshaped relationships, revealed the importance of subtle guidance, and highlighted the skill of those who worked silently to maintain order. The royal guard's role, often overlooked, had proven essential not only in protecting physical safety, but in guiding behavior, preventing conflict, and teaching the value of discretion and respect. In the end, what began as a seemingly minor incident, a playful prank, a moment of embarrassment, had set in motion a series of events that would influence the behavior, relationships, and understanding of everyone involved. It was a quiet story of learning, patience, and the unseen work of those who ensured that the palace remained a place of dignity, decorum, and harmony. And while no one outside the palace would ever know the full details, the lessons endured quietly, shaping the next interactions, guiding choices, and fostering a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that came with their unique lives. A few weeks had passed since the playful incident at the palace gathering, yet the memory of that evening lingered quietly in the minds of those involved. Camilla's son moved through the palace with his usual energy, though now his movements and interactions were subtly guided. He did not notice the extent of the watchful eyes on him, the gentle redirections, or the quiet lessons woven into every public appearance. For him, life at the palace still felt full of freedom, laughter, and charm. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing, and it was all due to the careful intervention of the royal guard. The guard had decided it was time to step up their efforts, though always with subtlety. They recognized that Camilla's son's impulsive behavior could, if unchecked, create a problem far beyond a single embarrassing moment. Their mission was clear: prevent another incident, protect George, and teach the young man the boundaries of decorum without making him feel constrained or punished. It required a delicate balance, a combination of vigilance, persuasion, and occasional quiet firmness. One morning, Camilla's son was scheduled to attend a charity event in one of the palace's grand gardens. He arrived in high spirits, greeting friends and staff with exaggerated bows and playful jokes, unaware that two members of the royal guard had shadowed him from the start. They moved quietly behind him, their presence unobtrusive, their eyes carefully observing every interaction. They knew that the key to guiding him was not confrontation but subtle influence. A misplaced word, an unexpected gesture, could undo weeks of careful teaching. As the young man approached a group of guests, he spotted George standing politely near the flower beds, engaging in calm conversation with a small circle of admirers. The memory of the earlier prank flickered in his mind for a moment, tempting him to try something mischievous again. But the watchful presence of the royal guard was enough to give him pause. Without fully understanding why, he felt a subtle restraint, a sense that certain actions might carry consequences. The invisible structure of guidance, silently imposed by the guard, began to shape his behavior. Throughout the event, the guard maintained their careful observation. When Camilla's son attempted to step slightly too close to a guest in a playful gesture, or make a comment that could be interpreted as teasing, one of the guards would redirect him with a gentle suggestion or an invitation to attend to another task. Each intervention was small, almost imperceptible, but cumulatively they taught him restraint. Slowly he began to notice patterns. Certain behaviors drew attention, certain jokes could cause discomfort, and sometimes it was wiser to remain calm rather than act on impulse. George, for his part, observed the young man with quiet curiosity. He was unaware of the full extent of the guard's influence, but he noticed a subtle change. Camilla's son seemed more measured, more aware of the people around him. There were still flashes of his characteristic humor, his energy and his charm, but the reckless edge that had led to the earlier incident seemed softened. George felt relief but remained cautious, knowing that change was gradual and that patience was required. Later that afternoon, the royal guard arranged a private meeting, a careful intervention designed to guide Camilla's son without confrontation. The young man was asked to join one of the senior guards in a small, quiet room, ostensibly to discuss the schedule for upcoming palace events. Once inside, the atmosphere was calm but serious, the walls lined with books and photographs that reflected the long history of the royal family. The senior guard spoke first, using a tone that was firm yet kind. "You have a lot of energy, and that is a good thing," he began. "But in the palace, every action is noticed. Every gesture can carry meaning beyond what you intend. We are here to help you understand how to navigate these situations so that your charm and energy are appreciated rather than causing trouble." Camilla's son listened, a mixture of curiosity and mild defensiveness in his expression. He was not used to being guided so directly, but the guard's calm manner kept him from feeling attacked. "I don't mean any harm," he said, shrugging slightly. "I just like to have fun." "Everyone laughs with me," the senior guard nodded. "I understand. But sometimes people may not react as you expect. Even small actions can have unintended effects. Our goal is to help you see those effects before they happen, so you can make choices that keep both yourself and others comfortable." The young man paused, considering the words. There was a subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of awareness that perhaps his actions could carry more weight than he had realized. The guard continued, providing specific examples of past incidents, including the recent gathering with George, but framed in a way that emphasized learning rather than blame. Each example was carefully chosen to show consequences without shaming him, reinforcing the idea that understanding boundaries was a strength, not a restriction. By the end of the discussion, Camilla's son had gained a new perspective. He began to understand that his impulsive energy could be powerful and positive if channeled correctly, but that it could also create tension if misused. The guard had not punished him, they had guided him, showing the difference between freedom and responsibility. It was a subtle but profound lesson, and though he did not fully articulate it, he carried it with him as he left the room. In the days that followed, the changes became more apparent. Camilla's son still laughed, joked, and charmed those around him, but the reckless edge was less pronounced. He began to pause before acting, to consider how his behavior might affect others, and to notice the subtle cues from George and the guests around him. The royal guard continued their quiet oversight, offering guidance and intervention only when truly necessary, allowing him the space to learn through observation and experience. George, meanwhile, found his confidence growing. He could engage with others without the constant anxiety of unexpected pranks or impulsive interruptions. He noticed the subtle shift in Camilla's son and felt a sense of gratitude toward the unseen forces that maintained balance and harmony. He began to appreciate not only the importance of personal composure, but also the network of support and guidance that operated quietly within the palace, unseen, but essential. The subtle changes in behavior also had a ripple effect. Staff members noticed that Camilla's son seemed more attentive and less prone to impulsive missteps. Family members observed a calmer energy in the house, a sense that the previous tension had been addressed without confrontation or embarrassment. Social gatherings became smoother, with laughter and conversation flowing more naturally. The palace, though still full of life and activity, felt a little more controlled, a little more harmonious. Yet the royal guard remained vigilant. They knew that change was not permanent, and that moments of impulsiveness could return if not guided. They continued to shadow him discreetly, observing interactions and offering small nudges of advice when needed. Their presence was invisible to outsiders, yet it created a framework within which Camilla's son could grow and learn. The balance between freedom and responsibility was delicate, but the guard's experience and careful approach ensured that it was maintained. One afternoon, a minor incident arose. Camilla's son, excited about a new project he wanted to introduce during a charity event, began to speak energetically to a group of guests, gesturing widely and drawing attention to himself. The royal guard intervened subtly, guiding him to focus on one speaker at a time, helping him channel his enthusiasm in a way that was engaging rather than overwhelming. The young man initially resisted, but the gentle and consistent guidance reminded him of the lessons he had learned. By the end of the event, his energy had been redirected successfully, earning admiration rather than concern. George observed the scene quietly, noting the transformation. He realized that the guard's influence was not about control but about teaching. Camilla's son had not been punished, he had been guided. The lesson was clear. Understanding boundaries, respecting others, and using one's energy wisely could lead to positive outcomes rather than embarrassment or conflict. The young prince reflected on how much easier it was to navigate palace life when such structures of support were in place. As weeks turned into months, the subtle but persistent guidance of the royal guard became an invisible thread weaving through the palace. Camilla's son grew more self-aware, George grew more confident, and the family and staff benefited from a smoother, more harmonious environment. The lessons of that initial evening had blossomed into a quiet but profound transformation. What had begun as a playful incident had become a catalyst for growth, understanding, and careful observation. In the palace, life continued with its formalities, events, and social obligations, but beneath the surface, something had changed. The royal guard, often unnoticed and rarely acknowledged, had demonstrated their essential role in maintaining not just security, but order, respect, and dignity. The young men had learned lessons that went far beyond etiquette or social grace. They had learned about responsibility, the consequences of impulsive behavior, and the power of subtle guidance. The palace itself seemed to breathe a little easier. Laughter returned to social gatherings without tension. Conversations flowed without fear of unexpected disruption, and a sense of balance had been restored. The young men, once at odds in subtle ways, now navigated the complex social world of royalty with more awareness, more patience, and a growing understanding of each other's perspectives. Though no one outside the palace would ever know the full story, the impact of the royal guard's careful guidance was profound. It was a quiet victory, achieved not with punishment or confrontation, but with observation, subtle intervention, and patient teaching. And for the young men involved, it was a lesson that would shape their choices, relationships, and understanding for years to come. Months had passed since the incident that had set the palace abuzz, and in the quiet corridors of the royal household, subtle changes were taking shape. Camilla's son, once impulsive and unpredictable, was now moving through life with a measured energy that reflected the guidance he had received. He had not become perfect overnight, nor had he lost the charm and warmth that made him endearing, but his reckless edges had softened. The lessons instilled by the royal guard were taking root, and his awareness of the effects of his actions on others had grown considerably. The transformation was gradual, observed most closely by the royal guard and George. The guards continued to provide subtle guidance, stepping in only when necessary, and their careful oversight had become almost invisible to the young man. He began to notice that some behaviors, which he had previously thought harmless, drew attention he hadn't anticipated. At first, he found this puzzling. Why did people look at him differently sometimes? Why did subtle corrections follow certain actions? Over time, he came to understand, in the palace, even small gestures mattered. George, meanwhile, continued to grow in confidence. The quiet reassurance of the guard's presence and the newfound restraint of Camilla's son allowed him to navigate public events with ease. He no longer worried constantly about unexpected pranks or disruptions. Instead, he could focus on his own engagements, his interactions with guests, and his understanding of social dynamics within the palace. The incident that had once caused embarrassment had become a quiet lesson in resilience and patience. One afternoon, a meeting was arranged in a smaller drawing room of the palace, a space often reserved for private discussions or strategy sessions. Camilla's son had been asked to attend, along with one of the senior guards. The purpose was not to reprimand him, but to reflect on progress, reinforce the importance of responsibility, and encourage him to internalize the lessons he had been learning. As he entered the room, the young man carried his usual air of energy and curiosity, though tempered by the understanding he had slowly developed. The senior guard welcomed him with a calm, measured tone. "You have made progress," he began. "Your energy, your charm, and your enthusiasm are your strengths, but the way you use them matters. You are learning how to direct your energy in ways that bring respect, admiration, and success, rather than embarrassment or tension." Camilla's son listened carefully, nodding slowly. He understood that this was not a lecture but a conversation designed to help him see the bigger picture. "I know I have made mistakes," he said quietly. "I never meant to upset anyone, but I can see now how some things I do can have unintended effects." The guard smiled gently. "And that understanding is important. Responsibility is not about giving up who you are. It is about knowing how your actions affect others and learning to make choices that bring the best outcomes for everyone." The discussion continued with examples from the young man's recent experiences. The guard highlighted times when his charm had created joy, laughter, or positive engagement, as well as moments when impulsive actions could have caused embarrassment if left unchecked. Camilla's son began to see patterns, how small gestures, playful jokes, and even energetic movements could be interpreted in ways he had not considered. He began to recognize that awareness and foresight were just as important as spontaneity. Over the next few days, the palace life reflected these lessons in practical ways. Camilla's son became more intentional in his interactions. During public events, he observed George carefully, noting his reactions and adjusting his own behavior to ensure comfort and respect. He approached staff with genuine consideration, making an effort to understand their perspectives. Slowly, those around him began to notice the change. Conversations were smoother, laughter was shared without tension, and small gestures of kindness became more frequent. One evening, during a reception in the palace's grand hall, Camilla's son found himself in a situation that tested his newfound restraint. A group of younger guests was telling jokes, teasing one another playfully, and he felt the familiar urge to jump in with a mischievous comment. The instinct was strong, the impulse natural, but he paused. He remembered the quiet lessons from the guard, the conversations in the small drawing room, and the subtle guidance that had shaped his behavior over the past months. Instead of interrupting or attempting a playful prank, he waited, listened, and then joined the conversation with a carefully chosen story that was both humorous and considerate. The laughter that followed was genuine, unforced, and inclusive. George, standing nearby, noticed the change immediately. The young man's energy had been channeled, not suppressed, and it had created a positive response rather than tension. George felt a quiet sense of pride and relief. The royal guard observed from a distance, their expressions calm but approving. Their subtle guidance had achieved its goal. Camilla's son was learning the delicate art of balancing charm with responsibility, energy with discretion, and spontaneity with consideration. It was not a matter of strict rules or punishment, but of understanding the impact of one's actions and adjusting accordingly. Over time, this balance became more evident in everyday life. The young man developed routines that allowed him to express his energy productively. He took part in charitable projects, assisting in planning events and engaging with guests in ways that highlighted his strengths. He began to mentor younger staff, offering playful guidance tempered by awareness. Each step reinforced his understanding that influence and responsibility went hand in hand. George, observing these developments, began to see the broader picture. He realized that the incident months earlier had not been just an embarrassing moment, but a catalyst for growth. He appreciated the quiet work of the Royal Guard, their patience, and their skill in guiding the young man without confrontation. The lesson was clear. In a world where every action could be magnified, awareness and discretion were essential. Even within the family, the changes were noticed. Camilla observed her son's growth with a mixture of pride and relief. She recognized his natural energy and charm, but now she could see that he was learning to use these qualities wisely. The household itself seemed calmer, more harmonious. Staff members found interactions smoother, events ran more efficiently, and the subtle tensions that had once lingered had diminished significantly. At the same time, the Royal Guard maintained their quiet vigilance. They understood that growth was not linear, and that occasional lapses could occur. Their role was not only to prevent mistakes, but also to reinforce positive behavior, ensuring that lessons were internalized, and that the young man continued to develop into a responsible, considerate member of the royal household. One afternoon, during a private garden walk, Camilla's son approached George with a thoughtful expression. "I realize now," he said, "that some of the things I do, even when I think they are harmless, can affect others. I want to be more careful, not just for myself, but for everyone around me." George smiled, appreciating the sincerity. "I've noticed the difference," he said. "You've learned to balance your energy with awareness. It makes a big difference to everyone, and it shows how much you've grown." The young man felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He understood that the change was gradual, that learning to control impulses and channel energy effectively required effort and patience. Yet he also realized that this growth did not diminish who he was. In fact, it strengthened his charm, his ability to connect with others, and his presence in the palace. As months continued, the positive effects of this transformation became even more apparent. Social gatherings were enjoyable rather than stressful, playful moments were inclusive and appreciated, and the relationship between George and Camilla's son developed into one of mutual respect. The palace, though still filled with life, laughter, and occasional mischief, had regained a balance that reflected both discipline and freedom. The incident that had started it all, the playful prank, was no longer remembered as a source of tension, but as the beginning of an important journey. The lessons learned, the guidance offered by the Royal Guard, and the gradual transformation of behavior had created an environment where charm, energy, and responsibility coexisted harmoniously. Camilla's son had learned that true influence came not from impulsive actions, but from thoughtful engagement. George had learned the value of patience, observation, and understanding. And the Royal Guard had demonstrated their essential role, not only in protecting safety, but in guiding growth, fostering harmony, and preserving dignity within the palace. In the quiet moments of reflection, Camilla's son recognized that the journey was ongoing. He understood that mistakes could still happen, but that awareness, consideration, and subtle guidance could prevent minor missteps from becoming major problems. He had learned to respect boundaries, appreciate discretion, and value the perspectives of those around him. The palace itself reflected these lessons. Its halls, gardens, and grand rooms remained spaces of elegance and tradition, but beneath the surface, they also became a place of learning, growth, and careful guidance. The balance between freedom and responsibility, spontaneity and consideration, energy and awareness was now woven into daily life. And so, what had begun as a moment of playful impulsiveness had transformed into a story of growth, responsibility, and understanding. Camilla's son, guided by patience and subtle intervention, had learned to navigate the complex world of the palace with awareness and charm. George had gained confidence and appreciation for the unseen structures that maintained harmony. And the Royal Guard had quietly achieved their goal, to preserve dignity, teach lessons, and guide without confrontation, ensuring that life in the palace continued with grace, laughter, and respect. Time passed in the palace, and the subtle changes that had begun months ago now felt permanent. Camilla's son had grown noticeably more aware of his surroundings, more thoughtful in his interactions, and more careful with his words and gestures. The once impulsive young man, who had unknowingly caused embarrassment during a single playful incident, had learned lessons that shaped not only his behavior, but also his relationships within the palace. He carried a quiet sense of responsibility that had not been there before, and while his energy and charm remained intact, they were now balanced by consideration and discretion. George, too, had evolved in his understanding of the complex dynamics within the palace. The incident that had once caused him anxiety had become a guidepost for personal growth. He now moved confidently through social gatherings, aware of the subtle signals around him, and capable of responding with patience and tact. He had learned that not all challenges required immediate reaction. Sometimes, observation and understanding were the most powerful tools. The young prince had gained a new level of self-assurance and calm that allowed him to interact freely while maintaining his dignity. The royal guard, whose guidance had been invisible but steady, continued to monitor the household subtly. Their presence was felt only when necessary, ensuring that harmony was maintained without overt control. They had succeeded in their goal. The impulsive energy of Camilla's son had been redirected, George's confidence had been restored, and the palace operated smoothly, with decorum and charm woven into every interaction. Their role remained largely unrecognized by the public, but their impact was undeniable. One morning, a family gathering was scheduled in one of the palace's more intimate rooms. The room was filled with sunlight streaming through tall windows, highlighting the polished wood floors and the carefully arranged furniture. Camilla's son arrived first, carrying a light-hearted energy but tempered with awareness. He greeted staff and family members politely, offering smiles that felt genuine rather than performative. George entered shortly after, his calm demeanor complementing the young man's warmth. The atmosphere in the room reflected the subtle shift that had occurred over the months. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter was shared without tension, and the interactions felt genuine. Camilla's son, noticing George, made a conscious effort to engage respectfully, listening carefully, responding thoughtfully, and occasionally offering playful remarks that were both humorous and considerate. George, in turn, responded warmly, recognizing the change in his cousin and appreciating the effort it took to balance charm with responsibility. The royal guard, stationed unobtrusively in the background, observed quietly. They had facilitated this transformation not through strict rules or punishments, but through patient guidance, subtle redirection, and careful mentorship. Their strategy had worked. Camilla's son had internalized the lessons, using them to navigate the social and familial complexities of the palace. George had grown stronger, more confident, and more understanding of human behavior. The household as a whole had gained harmony, with laughter, respect, and mutual consideration replacing the tension of past months. During the gathering, a minor situation arose that could have tested the young man's restraint. A playful challenge between two staff members prompted a mischievous thought in Camilla's son. In the past, he might have joined in impulsively, drawing attention to himself and potentially embarrassing someone. But this time he paused. He considered the potential effects, observed the reactions of those around him, and then chose to participate in a way that was lighthearted yet respectful. His energy brought joy rather than discomfort, and the outcome was received positively by everyone present. George noticed the change with quiet approval. He realized that the lessons of the past months were no longer theoretical, they were practical, visible, and enduring. The young man's behavior had become consistently thoughtful, demonstrating that true growth came not from fear of consequences, but from understanding and awareness. The incident that had sparked tension months ago now seemed like a distant memory, a starting point for learning and personal development. Camilla, observing her son and George, felt a mixture of pride and relief. She recognized the effort it had taken for her son to adjust his behavior, to internalize the subtle guidance of the royal guard, and to grow into a more responsible young man without losing his natural charm. She also appreciated George's maturity and composure, which had allowed him to respond to situations thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. The family dynamic, once marked by tension and unpredictability, now reflected balance, respect, and harmony. In the following weeks, the palace continued its routine of formal events, charitable engagements, and social gatherings. Camilla's son participated actively, contributing ideas, engaging with guests, and bringing energy and warmth to every occasion. George moved confidently among the guests, attentive and poised, able to enjoy the events without worry or anxiety. The royal guard maintained their discreet oversight, ensuring that balance was preserved, but increasingly their role became one of silent mentorship rather than active intervention. The changes in behavior were also reflected in the staff and household. Interactions were smoother, communication was clearer, and the overall atmosphere of the palace felt lighter. Guests noticed a difference, though they could not always articulate it. There was a sense of cohesion and ease that had previously been absent. Camilla's son's charm, once unpredictable, was now consistently engaging. George's calm, thoughtful approach created stability. Together, they contributed to a household environment that was both vibrant and harmonious. One day, during a private conversation in the palace gardens, Camilla's son reflected on his journey. "I never realized," he said to George, "how much my actions could affect everyone around me. I thought being playful and energetic was enough, but now I see that awareness matters just as much." George smiled. "It does," he replied, "and you've learned to balance it. Your energy is still yours, but now it brings happiness without causing tension. That's real growth." The young man nodded, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. He understood that personal growth was ongoing and that mistakes could still happen, but he also recognized that he now had the tools to navigate complex social situations with thoughtfulness and care. The lessons he had learned were no longer imposed externally. They had become part of his understanding of himself and his environment. The royal guard, observing from a distance, felt a quiet satisfaction. Their mission had been completed successfully. They had guided without confrontation, influenced without controlling, and taught lessons that were lasting. The palace had regained balance, the family dynamic had improved, and the young men involved had grown in maturity and understanding. It was a testament to patience, subtlety, and the power of quiet guidance. As time went on, the palace continued to host events with confidence and poise. Camilla's son became known for his lively yet thoughtful presence, while George's calm and composed demeanor earned admiration and respect. Together, they navigated the complexities of palace life with a sense of balance, demonstrating that growth, responsibility, and charm could coexist. Looking back, the incident that had begun as a minor prank now seemed almost insignificant in comparison to the growth it had inspired. What could have caused ongoing embarrassment or tension had instead become a catalyst for learning, understanding, and strengthened relationships. The young men had developed qualities that would serve them for years to come: awareness, patience, responsibility, and the ability to bring joy without causing harm. The palace itself, with its long history and grandeur, stood as a symbol of continuity and care. Within its walls, lessons were learned, guidance was offered, and lives were shaped by both visible and invisible hands. The royal guard, often unnoticed by the public, had played a vital role in shaping not only behavior but also relationships, demonstrating the importance of patience, observation, and subtle influence. In the quiet of the palace at the end of the day, as lights dimmed in the grand halls and soft music drifted through the corridors, Camilla's son and George often found themselves reflecting on their journey. They recognized the value of restraint, the power of consideration, and the strength that comes from understanding the consequences of one's actions. They understood that growth was ongoing, but that the foundation had been firmly established. The incident that had started it all, a single playful act that crossed a line, had set in motion a series of events that transformed the palace, the household, and the young men involved. It had demonstrated the importance of guidance, the value of patience, and the power of subtle intervention. Most importantly, it had shown that learning from mistakes, rather than being punished for them, could create lasting change. By the time the months had passed, Camilla's son had fully embraced the lessons he had been taught. He continued to be lively, charming, and playful, but now with a newfound awareness of boundaries and consequences. George had grown confident, thoughtful, and patient, able to navigate complex social dynamics with ease. The royal guard had ensured that harmony was maintained, teaching the young men the skills necessary to thrive within the unique environment of the palace. In the end, life in the palace had returned to a vibrant balance. Laughter, conversation, and charm coexisted with respect, consideration, and discretion. The story of that first evening, the prank that had caused a ripple of tension, was now remembered quietly as a turning point, a moment that had inspired growth, learning, and a deeper understanding of responsibility. The young men, guided by wisdom and patience, had learned the value of self-awareness, and the palace had regained the harmony that is so essential to its life and legacy. The lessons endured, quietly shaping each day, guiding every interaction, and fostering an environment where charm, energy, and responsibility could exist together, creating a palace that was not only grand in appearance, but also rich in understanding, respect, and care.